Actually, it's quite relevant that you sit at the table because I will make a reference to sitting at the table. You will note immediately that my paper is, while it's on agreement, I'm actually in disagreement with Costas Douzinas, so this should be interesting. First, a note on the double meaning of my title, Just Rage, Politics Without Consensus. I want to evoke the idea that just rage, as in morally right rage, is expressed in a politics of dissent, but also that politics without consensus or without agreement is just, as in only rage. Thus, a politics of disagreement might be good rage, but a politics without agreement might be only rage. The victim of injustice rightly craves relief from the suffering of tyranny and dehumanization, demands acknowledgement of wrongdoing and reparation. The longer these are refused, the greater the victim's righteous indignation and fury. It festers, and the call for justice may turn into a call for blood. Moral outrage and political dissent may turn into bloodlust. We are currently witnessing a disturbing acceptance of violence at the heart of emancipatory politics and of the thought that analyzes it. An acceptance that risks the permanent coupling of political dissent and extreme violence. In this paper, I'm arguing that without clear distinctions between violence and political resistance on the one hand, and between an artificial peace and consensus or agreement on the other, we seem doomed to witness or experience further the transformation of just rage into bloodlust. There is another option, a nonviolent politics that refuses the extremes of pure peace and a politics of death, of absolute consensus and dissensus. So the concerns of this paper arise out of what I believe is a disjunction between political theory and actuality when it comes to evaluating the terms of agreement and disagreement in political life. At the level of thought, we're seduced by a romanticized notion of agonistic politics as conflict, discord, disharmony, even hostility, premised on a disdain for the common, for unity, reconciliation, respect, and peaceful coexistence. Accompanying this appraisal of conflict is an approbation of moral outrage and the violence carried out in the name of justice. Meanwhile, in communities that are struggling to overcome the crippling legacy of extreme violence ignited by the very discord political theorists highlight, it is only respect, negotiation, compromise, and the search for commonality with one's enemies that offers any hope of a better existence. If you have no choice but to live beside the neighbor who killed members of your family, a way must be found to coexist. Sometimes concessions must be made that are not just, simply for the sake of survival. Conflict and the violence it may spawn are exhausting. When the struggle is against a formidable tyrant supported by a military funded by Western governments, rather than an enemy ethnic group or tribe, the call for nonviolence and agreement is much harder to make. Even the students at the University of California, Davis, confronted not by killer tanks, but by police brandishing pepper spray, know that locking arms in peaceful protest can pose a threat to the state and invite a violent response. In Tahrir Square, in Syria, Bahrain, and elsewhere, the lesson is the same, only painfully magnified. With the increasing policing of dissent, a global phenomenon, it is a difficult time to be advocating nonviolent politics, which is precisely why we should. Violence might pay, Hannah Arendt once said, but it pays indiscriminately. Violence changes the world, but the most probable change is to a more violent world. The question is, how do we protect the right to disobey without supporting violence? If conflict is at the heart of politics, the potential for violence is there too. I'm arguing that we can't think politics without agreement. In fact, agreement is the condition of possibility for disagreement, for the content of political life depends on our being with one another in a shared world. And you will recognize Arendt there. First, I want to defend the claim that we are witnessing a fetishization of conflict, arising partly out of a late 20th century valuation of difference and veneration of victimhood. Attention to the rights and trauma of victims, while necessary, has blinded us to the fact that violence is often, if not most of the time, justified in the name of victimhood, obscuring the line between victims and perpetrators, justice and vengeance, moral outrage and resentment. That today's victim might be yesterday's and perhaps tomorrow's perpetrator means that we can't simply affirm the moral immunity of victims, refusing to judge their actions out of compassion for their own suffering. It means that we must be vigilant in judging the violence that is excused on the basis of suffering. This failure to judge has been encouraged by intellectual and socio-political discourses that have polarized, politicized, and moralized the difference versus sameness distinction. A confrontational political attitude stressing the impossibility of understanding and relating to others, particularly others of another culture, has led to a clash of civilizations paradigm that may go hand in hand with a tolerance of intolerance. Finally, this stress on agonism and antagonism has been furthered by the security politics of the war on terror. Militaries need something to do. Heads of state who fear their unknown others must fabricate an enemy to preempt. Tribes are bereft of an identity without an opposing tribe. Provocation, preemption, confrontation. These are the terms of our current global politics, along with ubiquitous war. One manifestation of this movement in political thought is an acceptance or even approval of the rage and resentment evident in emancipatory struggles. Recent discussions of victims' resentment have shifted from criticizing the sentiment as a melancholic Nietzschean ressentiment to affirming it as a necessary barometer for measuring the desire for justice. Resentment and indignation toward the perpetrator is considered a necessary emotional response sparked by the victim's need for acknowledgement and empowerment. This moral affirmation of rage often ignores its often destructive effects and the fact that victims who express rage sometimes justify the most brutal retaliatory violence, rendering a just rage difficult to distinguish from an unjust rage. I will refer to two examples here. Judith Butler calls for an articulate and effective rage in her book, Frames of War, but falls short of telling us what this might look like. In her discussion of nonviolence, we witness the disappointing effects of this failure as Butler shuffles impotently between intellectual obfuscations of violence and nonviolence. How is it possible to call for nonviolence, Butler asks, if I, as a subject, am formed through norms that are by definition violent? She concludes only that nonviolence can't be a universal principle, that it arrives as an address or an appeal, entailing some work on our part to consider under what conditions we can be responsive to such a claim. Furthermore, this is not a call to a peaceful state, she says, but a struggle to make rage articulate and effective, the carefully crafted fuck you. And I apologize for my profanity. I read this passage while doing research in Sarajevo, noting that the buildings and sidewalks of that city are pockmarked with thousands of carefully crafted fuck yous. We can't tell from mortar fire or bombs whose rage is the good or just rage that Butler condones. There's an obfuscation of the terms of violence here that leaves us floundering in moral relativism. From this perspective, violence is everywhere, and there are no distinctions between the violence that kills, rapes, or maims, causing immense physical and or psychological damage, and the violence of naming, of subjection, or subjectivation, of interpolation. While in some cases this could be an equally debilitating violence, we must attend carefully to the distinctions. For most of us, the violence of subjectivation, or the violence inherent in language, occurs on quite a different scale than the violence of genocide, war, or ethno-political conflict. So I don't agree that violence should be defined as a disturbance or interruption. Even so, to argue that we can't make a universal call for nonviolence because our subjectivities are violently formed makes little sense. In fact, it seems to reinforce the urgency of making such a call. The normalization of violence, the relativism to which it has led due to a dogmatic veneration of difference, are in evidence here. In a similar vein, my second example, Peter Sloterdijk. No, I'm okay, thanks. Peter Sloterdijk tells us that resentment is ubiquitous in the world today. We don't have to look far to find examples supporting his claim that all revolutionary projects are born by and sustained through impulses within the pride, rage, indignation spectrum. But like Butler, Sloterdijk fails to fulfill his promise to construct a new theory for confronting conflict that breaks with entrenched dogma and respects what he calls the proper place of rage. He nevertheless highlights the extraordinary power of the human desire for justice and its potential for slipping into a thinly veiled desire for revenge. Examples of this abound, from American feminist Bell Hook's explicit and disturbing description of her longing to stab the white man sitting next to her on an airplane because of an act she perceived to be racist, to the moral justification of acts of terror by state or non-state actors as a legitimate response to injustice. In Butler and Sloterdijk, the moral assessment of rage is suspended, its devastating effects bracketed in the interest of providing a more tempered view, as Sloterdijk puts it, of rage as an intensive form of energy. From this vantage point, rage is generous, giving. The rage bearer wants to return a fair share of the excess of pain that has been stored up inside him to the person who has caused it but has not yet been punished. If rage is morally necessary in the struggle against injustice, its repression must be considered negatively. Indeed, Sloterdijk refers to the domestication or exorcism of rage and the Christian repression of rage, leaving that work to God in the afterlife, in terms that clearly associate the lack of rage with impotence. Nonviolence is then apolitical, and I should add here, peace is feminized then. While these thinkers do not explicitly advocate violence in response to injustice, their failure to distinguish between conflict and violence leaves them floundering in the chaos of human emotions, of indignation, rage, resentment, not irrational, and often justified but quite probably politically useless. Emancipatory politics threatens to become stuck at the level of expressing grievances. There's little chance here that the terms of peaceful agreement, negotiation, compromise, discussion could be considered anything but a violent suppression of a just rage. But without political agreement and action, rage might be only rage. This affirmation of rage and the difference it seeks to protect supports an understanding of politics as agonistic, as struggle, and anything less than an absolute valuation of difference and conflict is viewed as evidence of the dangerous sameness of totalitarianism, fascism, or the transcendence of reason. This anxiety over totalities in political thought is the legacy of reactions to the excesses of Hitler and Stalin and to the domination of colonized, racialized, or sexualized subjects. It is responsible for a valuation of difference that has held its ground for several decades of feminist, anti-racist, and post-colonial politics. Unfortunately, we seem to have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. In the earnest criticism of all unifying gestures, even human respect has become suspect. Respect, as Alexander Hirsch claims in the context of post-violent conflict politics, serves to politically neutralize those who would otherwise legitimately cleave to their hostility. Jacques Rancière's argument that disagreement is the primary condition of politics has been highly influential in this context. For Rancière, politics as we know it is actually policing, the practices of a police order obsessed with counting, distributing, and symbolizing the common. He distinguishes policing from his own version of politics, in which lies the power of the demos, and at its heart, disagreement. Such a division between policing and politics as the undoing of the police order holds immense appeal for those who place rage, resentment, and difference at the heart of emancipatory politics. Politics occurs rarely, according to Rancière, and only in the encounter between two heterogeneous processes, governing and the assumption of equality, or between policy, which seeks community consensus, and emancipation. Sorry. Part of Rancière's appeal lies in his emphasis on the assumption of equality. It avoids the pitfalls of identity politics, one of the most egregious of which is the promotion of a victim's worldview. Immune from responsibility, the object of a compassion that quickly turns to pity, the victim is robbed of agency and clings to the moral status conferred on her. In Rancière's political world, those who have no part, or the have-nots, act on the assumption of their equality. They don't wait for governing powers to notice them, nor do they languish in the stage of expressing grievances. But this is often overlooked, for the greater appeal of Rancière's notion of politics arises out of its exclusively emancipatory focus. He evokes what Derrida called emancipatory desire, the moral indignation and outrage against injustice that binds us to the righteous cause of the wounded and the disempowered. As political leadership in the West turns increasingly to the right, we are witnessing an increasing intolerance of political protest, peaceful or not, indisputable evidence of the state's investment in a docile society and of its anxiety over the exercise of actual democracy. Rancière's discussion of consensus makes sense in this context. At the same time, in the Middle East, the public expression of dissent, often violent, draws parallel desires here for a more authentic democracy and freedom from tyranny, both political and financial. Indeed, the spate of demonstrations against dictatorial rule across the Middle East this year and the simultaneous Occupy movement in cities around the world indicate that we are witnessing what Rancière calls exceptionally rare political moments in the crowds who refuse to succumb to dictators, acting according to the assumption that they are equal. So Rancière's focus on dissensus or disagreement has hit a public nerve. But I'm more interested in what he says, or rather does not say, about consensus. On the front flap of his book, Chronicles of Consensual Times, and I apologize, I am quoting a French philosopher in English. I didn't have time to look this up. We read, "Consensus is not peace. Instead, it refers to a map of operations of war. Lying at the heart of these consensual times are new forms of racism and ethnic cleansing, humanitarian wars, and wars against terror. The goal of consensus," he adds, "is to show that only one reality exists and that we have we have to consent to it. But is this all consensus is? Rancière's definition is a narrow one that applies only within the framework of politics as policing. A distinction between consensus and peaceful agreement is made solely on the basis of how we understand politics, evident in Rancière's 10th thesis on politics, which reads, "The essence of politics resides in the modes of dissensual subjectivation that reveal a society in its difference to itself. The essence of consensus, by contrast, does not consist in peaceful discussion and reasonable agreement as opposed to conflict or violence. Its essence lies in the annulment of dissensus. Consensus consists, then, in the reduction of politics to the police." This passage leaves open the possibility that peaceful discussion and reasonable agreement could be defined as another version of consensus, perhaps a better one, but Rancière does not take us there. If consensus is enforced from above, it is a perverted consensus. It's not an agreement arrived at through persuasion or negotiation. By narrowing the meaning of consensus and the context in which it occurs, Rancière is effectively undermining the very agency required by those who don't count to assume their equality. He's not recognizing the consensus of those who have no part, which indeed must be great in order for thousands to come together to demonstrate their equality. Thus, it's only when we assume a politics of the police that his definition of consensus is relevant. Even then, we must question whether agreement is beyond the bounds of politics and what we might lose in making that claim. The problem here is that we're conflating two very different political contexts. On the one hand, we have the contestation of state power, increasingly met with police repression in liberal democratic nations, although not, of course, on the scale that we are witnessing in Syria or Bahrain. Even peaceful protest is being defined as insurgency. We need to protect the right to protest and nurture a culture of disobedience exercised with the utmost moral and political judgment. But this is about the confrontation between the state and its people, not, as is the case with much of the violence in the world, between different peoples. We have to be careful to distinguish between these as they have quite different requirements for consensus and dissensus. The valuation of rage, resentment, and the accompanying devaluation of agreement, peace, and consensus in the context of the aftermath of conflict could be extremely dangerous. So, taking these different political contexts into account, it seems that we have two dangers from which we must protect politics. In a discussion with Sandro Mezzadra, Etienne Balibar characterizes these dangers as coming from enemies on both sides. On the one hand, politics is destroyed by extreme violence, the ubiquity of war and militarization, and on the other, by consensus, policies, and ideologies. A Foucauldian politics of war, politics as war, or politics as conflict, Balibar insists, must be preserved from dangers on all sides, protected as a kind of work of art. Mezzadra responds that there is no longer any politics to defend. He says, when we say that the problem is to save politics from the enemies of extreme violence on the one hand and consensus politics on the other hand, we take it for granted that there still exists a politics to be defended. Would it not be more productive, he asks, to start from the fact that this kind of politics does not exist anymore? Well, not everyone has the luxury of being so pessimistic. When death is a way of life, one must be optimistic. So yes, it is necessary to protect a politics of conflict or dissensus from the dangers of extreme violence, whether this violence arises from hostile and intractable disagreement or coerced peaceful agreement. But we might also say that we need to protect a consensual politics from the same dangers. A politics of agreement that recognizes what is common in human experience. The operative distinction is not, therefore, between disagreement and agreement, but between two extreme forms of violence that prevent politics from being anything but policing. The politics that we find negotiating these extremes, the politics that needs protecting, is constituted by both agreement and disagreement, always precarious, always provisional. There is no politics without this acknowledgement of both distinction and commonality. Every political grouping or community is, as Balibar puts it, an accidental community whose members are at once radically foreign to one another and incapable of surviving without one another. It is the latter point that we must emphasize in this time of ubiquitous war. It's curious, I find it very curious, that in our discussions of political conflict, we do not turn to those who have experienced its effects most viscerally. Those who work among populations victimized by war know that it is the struggle for points of agreement that enable former enemies to coexist. Survivors of political violence let go of grievances and hostilities for the sake of a future. What will prevent the explosion of further violence is agreement on common objectives, and above all, a sense of shared responsibility for a common world manifest through collective action. Most important in this agreement is the recognition of the humanity of the other. This, and only this recognition, disrupts entrenched ideological and hostile beliefs about the enemy other. It is dehumanization that enables us to kill, and the reversal of this process that enables us to survive violence, what Frantz Fanon called disalienation, claiming the right to human behavior from the other. This is rather close to Rancière's formulation of the assumption of equality. The victims of political violence, or those who don't count, assert their humanity and claim a place at the political table, recognizing their humanity in common with those who sit at the head of the table. This can't occur without a fundamental agreement among human beings. This is not only respect, but the acknowledgement that we can see in the other something of ourselves. While we could call this agreement the annulment of dissensus by consensus, as Rancière suggests, since the search for common ground provisionally displaces difference, it need not be understood as the reduction of politics to policing. In fact, the much more pressing concern for victims of violent conflict is whether disagreement has annulled agreement. When this happens, the result is more often than not death and destruction, or at the very least, one blind and deaf population against another, a wall of silence between them. I know of no better description of this outcome than what we find in Writing in the Dark, a book of essays by the Israeli author David Grossman. In a rich and poignant discussion of the fiction writer's unique relationship to his characters, Grossman draws a lesson for those living in the tragic reality that is Israel and Palestine. It is only when we are forced to recognize the other's needs, he writes, their rightful existence, stories, pain, and hope, that we can begin to dismantle the barriers to resolving the conflict. And I will read a rather long passage here from him. Because when we know the other from within him, even if that other is our enemy, we can never again be completely indifferent to him. Something inside us becomes committed to him, or at least to his complexities. It becomes difficult for us to completely deny him or cancel him out as not human. We can no longer employ our usual ease and expertise to avoid his suffering, his justice, his story. Perhaps we can even be a little more tolerant of his mistakes, for we then see these mistakes as part of his tragedy. And if we have any strength and generosity remaining, we can even create a situation in which it is easier for our enemy to step out of his own traps. We too may benefit from this. It is difficult to imagine a conversation between David Grossman or others living inside a conflict zone and those who believe that the beating heart of politics is conflict, while peace is the suppression of difference. Except, of course, with Hamas, who complain that peace means surrender, something they are never prepared to do. Those who live in the face of tyranny will always have a different perspective. And I'll come back to this point. Grossman points out that Israeli society can't continue to exist for very long in a state of unresolved conflict because life in a constant climate of violence, occupation, terror, anxiety, and hopelessness, he says, is taking a toll that Israel can't withstand. Grossman concludes that the disagreements between right and left are not that significant, and that most Israeli citizens understand that the country will be partitioned and a Palestinian state will arise. Why then, he asks, do we continue to exhaust ourselves with the internal strife that has been going on for almost 40 years? Why does the political leadership continue to reflect the positions of the extremists and not of the majority? Surely our situation would be far better, he says, if we reached a national accord among ourselves before circumstances, external pressures, a new intifada, or another war force us to do so. It is about demanding the life we deserve to live, Grossman says. He is pointing here to an understanding of agreement that is indispensable for politics, a national accord that is not the heavy hand of the state enforcing a consensual peace that risks violence, but an agreement that recognizes the equality of the other. It is premised on empathy, an imaginative identification with another's predicament, based on negotiation, compromise, and a pragmatic desire for more peaceful relations. And I'm coming to my conclusion. We don't live in a time of consensus. With increasing militarization around the world, we need to worry about a political approach that fetishizes conflict and gives free rein to the expression of justified rage and resentment, risking infinite cycles of violence. Without an analysis that distinguishes between agreement and violence, an understanding of politics as difference without consensus can lead to a romanticization of violent political resistance and a denigration of peaceful agreement. We might then reverse the terms of Rancière's 10th thesis on politics. The essence of politics resides not in the modes of dissensual subjectivation that reveal a society in its difference to itself, but in the modes of consensual subjectivation that reveal a society in what is common to itself. The intractable nature of the conflict in Israel and Palestine makes this common to itself extraordinarily difficult to find, but all the more necessary. We could make the same statement regarding other regions in the world, like this one, where the only hope of reversing the effects of ethnic cleansing rests in the fragile points of contact between individuals and groups, traumatized to varying degrees, victims and perpetrators alike suffering the aftermath of war, again to varying degrees. Those who work with populations victimized by violence know this. When former enemies have no choice but to live together, differences must be set aside in the interest of building a future. What brings traumatized groups together is collective action. No one, of course, says this is an easy road. In fact, it might be close to impossible. But humankind does not recreate itself through violence, as Sartre contended. The